So let's talk about what really happens when the anxious finally decides to walk away from the avoidant, because for a long time, the anxious partner is the one chasing, worrying, trying to fix the relationship, always afraid of losing it. But the moment they hit their breaking point and choose themselves instead, that's when the real story begins. And the first shift is the shock, because avoidants never expect the anxious to actually leave. They've built a dynamic where they believe distance and silence will always bring the anxious back. But when it doesn't, it shakes them in a way they've never experienced before. The second shift is the change in power. Suddenly, the anxious is no longer controlled by fear or desperate longing. They step into their strength, and that reversal flips the emotional balance on its head. The third shift is the growth of self-worth in the anxious partner, because leaving isn't just walking away from someone, it's choosing to finally believe they deserve more. And with that choice comes a new kind of confidence that radiates. The fourth shift is the delayed feelings that surface in the avoidant, because only in the absence of that constant reassurance do they realize what they had. And for many, that realization comes too late. And the fifth and final shift is what happens after. The anxious learns to approach love from a place of security instead of fear, while the avoidant is forced to confront patterns that no longer work. And those 5 shifts change everything about how both people see themselves, each other, and love going forward. When the anxious partner finally reaches that breaking point and decides to walk away, the very first thing that happens is the shockwave it sends through the avoidant. For a long time, the avoidant has lived in a dynamic where they felt certain the anxious partner would always stay, always come back, always chase, and that certainty gave them a false sense of control. They believed that no matter how much they pulled away, no matter how cold or distant they became, the anxious would tolerate it and keep trying. When that belief suddenly breaks, when the anxious actually takes their energy, their love, their consistency, and withdraws it completely, the avoidant is thrown into an unexpected emotional crisis. It feels destabilizing because the very thing they thought they could always count on, that constant pursuit, is no longer there, and they don't have the skills to process the emptiness that creates. The shock here is not just about losing the anxious person, it's about the collapse of a system the avoidant has relied on for security. Ironically, while the avoidant spent so much time pushing the anxious away, they were still benefiting from knowing that person would always be there. It was a safety net, a reassurance that they didn't have to fully engage because someone else was doing the emotional work for them. When the anxious removes themselves, that safety net vanishes, and the avoidant is left with an unfamiliar silence. That silence can feel louder than any words ever spoken, because it forces the avoidant to sit with themselves, to face feelings they've long suppressed, and to realize that the dynamic they counted on has collapsed overnight. The impact of this shock is even greater because avoidants tend to underestimate the resilience of the anxious partner. They assume that because the anxious has tolerated so much in the past, they will always tolerate more in the future. They mistake endurance for weakness, not realizing that endurance can transform into strength the moment the anxious decides they've had enough. That's why the moment of walking away feels like such a betrayal to the avoidant. It violates the story they told themselves about how much control they had. In reality, it's not betrayal at all, but rather a reclaiming of power by the anxious. Still, from the avoidant's perspective, it hits like a sudden and jarring wake-up call that shakes the foundation of their emotional world. Once this shock sets in, the avoidant may begin to feel emotions they rarely allowed themselves to feel before. Fear creeps in where confidence once stood. Insecurity begins to replace indifference. The loss of someone who once provided constant reassurance exposes the avoidant's vulnerability, and many are completely unprepared for that level of rawness. They can no longer hide behind avoidance tactics because those tactics depended on the anxious continuing to engage. With no one left to push away, their strategies collapse and they are left facing an inner void. This moment can trigger a deep sense of panic because it's not just about losing a partner, it's about losing the dynamic that made them feel safe in their avoidance. This shift also has a ripple effect on how the avoidant views themselves. Many begin to question their choices, wondering if their behavior was worth the cost of losing someone who cared so deeply for them. At first, they may try to rationalize, to convince themselves that they are better off, but the silence keeps echoing back to them. They might find themselves replaying moments in their mind, noticing the way the anxious once lit up when they gave small amounts of attention, and realizing those moments will no longer return. The anxious leaving forces them to see not just what they've lost, but also the role they played in creating that loss. That realization, though often delayed, adds another layer to the shock, turning it into a painful form of self-awareness. As this first major shift unfolds, the avoidant is confronted with an emotional landscape they've avoided their whole lives. They feel the weight of absence, the sting of regret, and the destabilizing fear of being without the one person who continually gave them validation. For the anxious, this step of leaving represents freedom, but for the avoidant, it represents collapse. The shock is not fleeting, it lingers, it gnaws, and it opens doors to emotions they never wanted to deal with. What makes this stage so powerful is that it flips the script completely. The one who once feared abandonment is now the one who left, and the one who once believed they could never be abandoned is now forced to face the reality that they were, and that reversal changes everything about how they see the anxious, themselves, and the dynamics of love. The second major emotional shift comes when the power dynamics inside the relationship begin to completely reverse. And this is something that both the anxious and the avoidant feel in very different ways. For the longest time, the avoidant seemed to hold the upper hand, pulling away when things got close, knowing the anxious would always move toward them, always bridge the distance, always fight to keep the bond alive. That dynamic created an invisible power imbalance where the avoidant could dictate the pace, the intimacy, and the connection, while the anxious remained locked in a cycle of proving their worth. But the moment the anxious decides to leave, all of that power instantly changes hands, and the shift is as dramatic as it is undeniable. Suddenly, the one who once begged for scraps of affection is the one who has taken back control, and the avoidant who thought they were safe in distance now finds themselves destabilized by a loss of influence they never imagined would disappear. What makes this shift so impactful is the way it alters not just behavior, but identity. For the anxious partner, the act of walking away is more than just leaving a relationship. It is reclaiming a sense of self that had been buried under constant worry and fear. They no longer seek validation from the avoidant because their decision itself becomes validation. Choosing to step out of a dynamic that was draining them is the clearest proof they could ever have that they are stronger than the fear of being alone. This shift in energy radiates outward. Their posture changes, their tone changes, their presence feels more assured, and the avoidant notices that difference immediately. Where once they could rely on the anxious to bend, now they see someone standing tall, and that shift in perception adds to the power reversal taking place between them. For the avoidant, this change can feel like a direct threat to the identity they created within the relationship. They were the ones who believed they had the freedom, the space, the upper ground, and now all of that slips away in an instant. It's disorienting because they can no longer rely on the dynamic that kept them feeling in control. Instead, they find themselves reacting, questioning, chasing, even if only in their mind. The absence of the anxious pursuit creates a void, and inside that void, the avoidant feels powerless. Their old tactics no longer work. Silence doesn't draw attention. Withdrawal doesn't pull the other person back in. Indifference doesn't maintain balance. The very strategies that once gave them power now leave them stranded, and that reversal exposes how fragile their control truly was. This reversal is not always visible on the surface, but it is deeply felt internally. The anxious partner feels a new kind of liberation, a quiet strength that comes from no longer being controlled by fear. The avoidant feels a creeping sense of unease because they are no longer the ones setting the emotional tone. The dynamic has flipped, and with it comes a new reality that neither of them can ignore. For the anxious, that new reality feels expansive, like stepping into a version of themselves they had long forgotten. For the avoidant, that new reality feels constricting, like being trapped in an unfamiliar role where they no longer call the shots. This emotional tug of war creates a moment of reckoning, one that can't be reversed to the way things once were. The anxious may not even fully realize the power they now hold, because their choice to leave often comes from a place of necessity, from survival, from finally protecting themselves. But that choice carries more weight than they imagine, because it forces the avoidant to see them in an entirely different light. They are no longer the person who bends, they are the person who can walk away. That kind of strength commands respect, even if the avoidant struggles to admit it. The power once used against the anxious now fuels their confidence, and the avoidant finds themselves reacting to a dynamic they can no longer control. That reversal doesn't just change the way the relationship ended, it changes the way both people will view relationships going forward. At the heart of this shift lies a profound truth. Power in relationships is never truly about who withdraws or who chases, but about who values themselves enough to set the terms of how they will be treated. When the anxious partner finally realizes this and chooses to walk, they flip an entire script that had defined their connection for so long. The avoidant, once comfortable in the belief that they held control, now faces the reality that their power was always dependent on the anxious playing a role they no longer agree to play. And in that moment, the anxious becomes free, while the avoidant is left wrestling with the loss of control that once defined their sense of security. The third major emotional shift happens inside the anxious partner, and it is one of the most powerful transformations they will ever experience. Because walking away is not just about ending a relationship, it is about choosing themselves in a way they have rarely done before. For so long, their identity in the relationship was tied to keeping things together, to anticipating the avoidance moods, to soothing the silence, to filling the gaps. Their energy was constantly invested in proving they were enough, fighting for love, and managing the fear of abandonment that lived in the back of their mind. But when they reach that point where they decide to leave, something remarkable changes. The anxious no longer defines themselves by what they can do for the avoidant. They begin to define themselves by the courage it takes to walk away from someone who could not meet them where they were. This shift unlocks a deeper sense of worth that was buried under the layers of fear and longing. In the beginning, this transformation may not feel like empowerment right away. There is often sadness, grief, and even guilt for leaving, because the anxious has trained themselves to believe that if they just held on a little longer, things would get better. But as the days pass, that sadness begins to soften into clarity. They start to see that the act of leaving was not a sign of failure, but a declaration of strength. They recognize that loving someone deeply does not mean tolerating neglect, distance, or constant uncertainty. This clarity becomes a foundation for confidence, and for the first time, the anxious realizes that their love and their effort are valuable gifts, not tools to be wasted on someone who cannot appreciate them. That recognition is the beginning of a new identity built on self-respect. With this newfound clarity comes a shift in how they carry themselves. The anxious begins to feel lighter, freer, more grounded in who they are. They no longer live with the constant anxiety of waiting for a text, worrying about a withdrawal, or analyzing every silence. The absence of that emotional weight creates space for new energy that can be directed inward instead of outward. They discover that they have more time, more peace, and more control over their emotions, and this discovery reinforces the idea that they were always capable of thriving without the avoidant. Each small step toward independence builds momentum, and that momentum fuels an entirely different kind of confidence, one that radiates outward and shifts how others see them as well. This transformation also teaches the anxious a new relationship with fear. Before, the fear of being abandoned was paralyzing. It dictated their actions and held them captive in a cycle of chasing love that felt just out of reach. But once they leave, they realize that what they feared most, being without the avoidant, has already happened, and they are still standing. In fact, they are stronger for it. That realization changes their relationship with fear forever, because they learn they can face it and come out on the other side. The anxious begins to see that fear is not a signal to cling tighter, but a reminder of their capacity to survive and grow. This shift in perspective is liberating because it frees them from the chains of old patterns that once dictated their choices. Over time, this new sense of worth and confidence begins to ripple into every area of their life. They approach friendships differently, valuing mutual effort instead of one-sided giving. They pursue goals with more determination because they no longer carry the weight of needing someone else's validation to feel complete. They look at love with fresh eyes, not as a desperate chase, but as a mutual exchange where their needs and desires matter just as much as their partners. The anxious, once defined by a fear of loss, transforms into someone who knows the power of choice, and that power becomes the core of their new identity. The shift is not only emotional, it is practical. It changes how they walk, how they speak, how they show up in the world, because they are no longer weighed down by the belief that they are only worthy when someone else confirms it. Perhaps the most profound part of this transformation is the realization that leaving was never about punishing the avoidant, it was about healing themselves. The anxious learns that love is not about endurance alone, but about alignment, respect, and reciprocity. They finally see that what they once thought of as weakness, their deep sensitivity, their strong desire for closeness, was never weakness at all. It was strength waiting for the right container, a gift waiting for the right person. By walking away, they protect that gift, they reclaim it, and they carry it into a future where it will be valued instead of dismissed. This is the third shift, and it marks the moment the anxious turns their fear into power, their doubt into clarity, and their longing into self-love. The fourth major emotional shift reveals itself inside the avoidant once the anxious has finally gone silent and stayed gone long enough for reality to sink in. At first, the avoidant may try to convince themselves that nothing has really changed, that they are fine, that they never needed the anxious partner as much as the anxious needed them, but that illusion does not hold up over time. As the absence stretches on, the avoidant begins to feel the hollowness that was previously masked by the constant presence of someone willing to fight for them. Without the reassurance of being pursued, without the safety net of knowing the anxious would always return, the avoidant is forced into a confrontation with feelings they worked hard to avoid. What surfaces is not only loneliness, but also an uncomfortable awareness of what they have lost, and that awareness begins to crack open emotions that they spent years trying to suppress. These emotions often come in delayed waves, surprising the avoidant because they are not used to experiencing them so intensely. It may begin with subtle memories, moments when the anxious showed love, care, or patience, replaying in the avoidant's mind when they least expect it. A song, a place, a random object can trigger a flashback that reminds them of what once was, and in that moment, they feel the depth of the anxious partner's presence in a way they never did when they were together. The realization that those gestures, those efforts, those moments of devotion are no longer accessible brings an ache that avoidance cannot protect them from. It is here that regret starts to take root, and it grows heavier the longer the anxious remains silent. The avoidant begins to notice how their old strategies no longer provide the comfort they once did. Withdrawal feels emptier without someone trying to bridge the gap. Silence no longer has power when no one is waiting on the other end. Their attempts at distraction lose effectiveness because the unresolved emotions demand attention, and the absence of the anxious makes it impossible to ignore. This shift exposes a vulnerability they have long denied, because for the first time, the avoidant is not just dealing with external pressure, but with their own internal recognition of loss. That recognition is sharp, because it carries with it the awareness that they played a role in creating this outcome, and that realization is one they cannot easily escape. What often surprises the avoidant most during this shift is how much they actually cared, even if they could not express it properly at the time. In their own way, they did value the anxious, but their fear of intimacy, their discomfort with closeness, kept them from showing it fully. When the anxious leaves, the wall that once protected them becomes the very thing that isolates them. they start to see the pattern more clearly, the pushing away, the distancing, the coldness, and how those behaviors chipped away at the relationship until there was nothing left to hold on to. This delayed awareness can bring guilt, frustration, and even panic because the avoidant recognizes the truth too late when the anxious has already moved forward. As this awareness deepens, the avoidant may attempt to reach out, sometimes subtly, sometimes desperately, hoping to reignite the old dynamic, but they quickly discover that the anxious is no longer in the same place. This realization makes the shift even more painful because it highlights how much has changed. The avoidant no longer holds the same influence, and the anxious no longer responds in the ways they once did. That change forces the avoidant to sit with feelings of rejection they thought they were immune to. They feel the sting of being on the outside, looking in, wishing for the comfort of a connection they once dismissed. It is a reversal that humbles them because it strips away the illusion of control they clung to for so long. In this stage, the avoidant comes face to face with the cost of their detachment. They begin to understand that what they thought was protection, keeping distance, avoiding vulnerability, was actually sabotage. They sacrificed closeness for safety, and in doing so, lost the very connection they secretly craved. The delayed emotions that emerge are not just about missing the anxious partner. They are about confronting their own patterns and realizing how much those patterns have shaped their lives. This is why the fourth shift is so profound, because it is not only the loss of someone they loved, but also the collision with a truth they can no longer deny. That avoidance does not protect them from pain, it simply delays it until it arrives all at once, heavier than they ever imagined. The fifth major emotional shift takes place after the dust has settled, when both the anxious and the avoidant are no longer caught in the immediate storm of leaving or being left. And what emerges is a transformation in how each of them approaches love and connection in the future. For the anxious partner, this shift is about finally breaking the cycle that kept them locked in fear-driven relationships. Having chosen themselves and walked away, they now carry with them the understanding that love should not require constant chasing or proving. They learn that they are worthy of a partnership where effort is balanced and where their emotional needs are not treated as burdens. This changes the way they show up in future relationships, because instead of bending themselves to fit someone else's comfort zone, they now honor their own boundaries and expect reciprocity. That expectation does not make them harder to love. It makes them clearer about what love really means, and it ensures they no longer settle for less than they deserve. For the avoidant, the long-term shift is different, but just as significant. The loss of the anxious partner forces them to look at their patterns more honestly than ever before, because they can no longer deny the consequences of their behavior. When someone who loved them deeply is gone and not coming back, it leaves a scar that lingers. And that scar becomes a reminder of how avoidance creates the very isolation they fear most. In future relationships, they may try to hold back less, share a little more, or stay present when their instinct is to run, because they have seen firsthand what happens when they let their fear dictate their actions. While not every avoidant changes immediately, the experience of losing someone who mattered can plant seeds of awareness that eventually grow into a willingness to confront their fears of intimacy. That shift is not easy, but it is necessary if they want to break their own cycle of running from closeness. The anxious partner's shift into confidence and clarity often inspires them to raise their standards, not just in love, but in life. They pursue opportunities they might have once dismissed. They invest in friendships that feel mutual, and they protect their energy more carefully. Their journey out of fear and into self-respect gives them a stronger sense of agency, and this spills over into every choice they make. They no longer live under the shadow of rejection, because they know they can survive it. Instead of avoiding conflict or discomfort, they face it directly, understanding that their worth is not on trial every time someone pulls away. This makes them more attractive to partners who are capable of secure connection because they now operate from a place of groundedness rather than desperation. The anxious who once gave endlessly without receiving learns to value balance, and in doing so, they attract people who are ready to meet them equally. Meanwhile, the avoidant begins to feel the weight of their solitude differently than before. What once felt like safety and distance now feels like emptiness, and that emptiness can push them to reevaluate their priorities. They start to understand that love requires presence, consistency, and vulnerability, and that avoidance is not freedom but limitation. The absence of the anxious partner becomes a mirror that forces them to confront the cost of detachment, and though it is painful, it can serve as a catalyst for growth. If they are willing, they begin to practice showing up differently, not only in romantic relationships, but also in friendships, family connections, and even in how they relate to themselves. This shift may not erase their fears overnight, but it creates a desire to connect rather than a reflex to withdraw. And that desire is the first step toward lasting change. As both partners move forward, their journeys highlight how leaving and being left can shape people in lasting ways. The anxious discovers strength in silence, learning that their deepest fear of abandonment was actually the key to their liberation. By surviving it, they free themselves from the grip of insecurity and become someone who chooses love rather than chases it. The avoidant discovers pain in silence, learning that their constant retreat does not shield them from hurt, but amplifies it when love is gone. By experiencing the consequences of their distance, they confront the reality that intimacy is not a threat, but a necessity if they want connection to last. Both carry these lessons forward, reshaping how they love, how they communicate, and how they protect their hearts in healthier ways.